What's going on today, my friends? I am back here with another introduction to competitive Pokemon, and today I just wanted to talk about some team archetypes because I kind of mentioned them in some old videos for the intro to competitive Pokemon. But you get the point. We're going to be talking about team composition and what teams are supposed to do. So basically, I'm trying to make it easy, so I'm going to break them down into four major categories, and within these categories there are major subsections in different kinds of teams, especially for hyper offensive and stall and everything. So I'm probably going to do more in-depth videos for hyper offense. I might even go into one for many different kinds and multiple different videos on hyper offense and stuff, but I just want to give you the general idea for four main types of teams to start out with. So first we're just going to start out with a balanced team. So this is kind of what if you're kind of getting into the game, this might be a good place to start because it's kind of like you're balanced between offensive and defensive mons. So I kind of just threw these mons on a team. It's not necessarily a super well made team, but basically what you can do is look up offensive cores and defensive cores, and you can kind of just mash them together so that you have defensive mons that you can switch into, like Toxapex and Celesteela here. So these mons can take your hits here, and then you also have Ferrothorn, which can also take hits, can set up hazards for you. Lando is another one who sets up Stealth Rock, but he's also offensive, so it's kind of like a balance. And then here's your main offensive core, which is Tapu Koko and Greninja. So you have your defense, your offense, and then kind of your mix, so it gives you a nice balance. It's pretty straightforward. You find an offensive core, you find a defensive core, and then you kind of find things to mesh those together, find any weaknesses on your team and try to patch those up, and there, you have a balanced team. So balance is really great for just learning the game, and if you can make a good enough core, that core can sometimes beat teams on its own, and then sometimes if you make a good offensive core, they can beat teams on their own. So it's very matchup dependent how your balanced team does against another team, but balance can be kind of anywhere on the spectrum, and you might want to throw some stall breakers on there or something as well to give you a better stall matchup. I'll be talking about stall later in the video. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the bulky offense. So this is probably one of my favorite kinds of teams to play because I like to kind of absorb hits and then hit people really hard back. And that's just kind of my play style because it gives me a little bit of security knowing that I can kind of take hits and I don't have to rely completely on reading my opponent, but I also have the power to just run through opposing teams. So it still requires some better reads to play this kind of team, but it's less than something like hyper offense, which I'm going to talk about right after this. So it takes less reads than a hyper offensive team because you kind of do have the ability to sponge some hits, but the idea is just you have some big wall breakers and you can just power through your opponent's team. So a team like this has a really good core with Fire, Water, and Grass, Tapu Bulu, Heatran, and Suicune. So the Fire, Water, Grass core is just a really good core. I'll probably do a video later on cores, but it's just really great for absorbing hits and switching between the three. And then you have Landorus for rocks and Zapdos to defog rocks, and then Kyurem is just a beast of a wall breaker. So that team you can kind of switch around and take a few hits, but the idea is that you want to still overpower your opponent's team. So if you play something if you play against a hyper offensive team that just wants to power through the opposing team, you might be able to make some good switches and be in a beneficial position, and then they will hopefully be weaker than your team defensively, so that will give you some ability to break through some of their powerful attackers, and then that will let you eventually power through their team to win the game. So it's kind of a little bit of a little bit slower of a game than a hyper offensive team, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it's a little bit faster than Balance. You're a little bit more into wall breaking and like overpowering your team. Balance is kind of trying to find this, find any way you can beat your opponent. Sometimes it's defensively, sometimes it's offensively. It depends on what kind of team you're playing. Bulky offense kind of always has this idea that you want to overpower your opponent, but you can also kind of sponge hits so that there's less guesswork in what your opponent's going to do. So you still want to overpower them, and that's pretty much the way you're always going to win. You have to overpower your opponent with a bulky offensive team, but you can kind of take hits and then overpower them. With a team like a hyper offensive team, which there are so many kinds of hyper offensive teams, and I'm going to give a lot of them their own video probably because they all deserve it and there's a lot to talk about. This is just a certain kind of hyper offensive team. This is called a double focus sash lead. Typically the leads are Greninja and Excadrill because they can set up hazards, spikes, and stealth rock to kind of wear down your opponent's team on switch in, and Excadrill can rapid spin to keep hazards off your side of the field so you can keep your Pokemon healthy. And then you kind of just have mons that you want to overpower your opponent with. And typically these mons are a little bit less like bulky, like they can't take as many hits. So something like Blacephalon is definitely not bulky, but like if he gets going and he can overpower his opponent and outspeed them, he can just start going and take off. So on a hyper offensive team, sometimes it's really only one Pokemon on your team that has a good matchup against your opponent, and you just want to set it up so that that one Pokemon can sweep through your entire team, your entire opponent's 6. So say you have something like a Choice Scarf Blacephalon. You have Beast Boost, so every time you get a kill, you can get a special attack raise. You have something like Shadow Ball and Flamethrower. If you get those special attack raises and you have the Choice Scarf to make you faster, you can sometimes just run through your opponent's team. Or something like Gyarados can have Dragon Dance, and after he gets up a couple Dragon Dances, maybe he can run through his opponent's team. Mimikyu would be on there to kind of have that insurance because he has the disguise, so he can take one hit always and kill anything that's trying to set up against your team, like you might be trying to do to the opponent. So he's kind of like an insurance policy. And then Tapu Koko is just like a fast, good late game sweeper. If you give it something like Choice Specs, it's very strong and it's very fast. So in the late game, if you have just like a couple things on your opponent's team that need to be killed, you can clean it up. So the idea of a hyper offensive team is to just overpower your opponent. Like Greninja and Excadrill are almost like suicide leads. Like sometimes on a hyper offensive team, you'll have a suicide lead that's literally out there to set up like Stealth Rock and then die. So some teams will run a Landorus with Stealth Rock and Explosion. He's there to set up the Stealth Rock and then explode so that he's gone, and you can just quickly try to overpower your team. So hyper offensive games can go a lot faster. So if you don't want to be in for the long haul and like have to play really long games, you can go for a hyper offensive team and you can get a couple games in the time that like a balanced team would be able to play one game. So hyper offensive can be really fun because it's all about making reads on your opponent. And if you beat your opponent, you like really beat your opponent usually. Like it's like a beatdown. Sometimes you can still have close games, but it's really all about punching a hole in your opponent's team and just running through them. That's the win condition for this team. So again, balance is kind of like find an offensive or defensive way to either stop your opponent from winning or just like be able to drive a wedge through their team and kill them. Bulky offensive is overpowering your opponent, but you can kind of take hits. Hyper offensive is very straightforward, like you have to overpower your opponent and punch a hole through their team or they're going to beat you. And the last archetype I want to talk about is Stall. So Stall is just like it sounds like. It's a lot of people's least favorite playstyle. A lot of people really, really hate it because it can be frustrating to play against. I actually have an entire stall team here because this is a very common team that you'll see. But the idea of a stall team is to just outlive your opponent. So with a team like Hyper Offensive, if they can't punch through your team, they pretty much lose because they can't kill your team, and they'll eventually be chipped away at until they finally die. So a stall team is essentially there to not let your opponent break through your team. And if your opponent can't break through your team, they're as good as done. So stall games will last a very, very long time. Depending on the matchup, sometimes stall can just win at the startup screen. If you don't have a good matchup against stall, you're as good as done because you can't break through their core and they'll just automatically win. So that can be very frustrating for players, especially newer players. I find in the scene that very new players have a lot of trouble with stall because it kind of takes experience to break it. But like, now that I've gotten better at the game over the years, I can really appreciate the stall matchup more, and I actually kind of have fun breaking it. You kind of have to think of it like a puzzle when you're playing against it. You kind of have to think of it as a puzzle that you have to make reads on and break. And once you take out one piece of the puzzle, like say you kill their Chansey, and Chansey's like a big part of every stall team ever. I don't know if people make stall teams in OU without Chansey. Like, after you break down their Chansey or after you break down their Sableye or something, that lets you punch a hole in their team, because every component of the stall team is very important to how the entire team functions. So you kind of want to pin down one thing, kill it, and then you can kind of dismantle the rest from there. So for example, if you can get the kill on their Sableye, this should be Magic Bounce after it Mega Evolves, but if you can get the kill on their Sableye, then maybe you can get your Stealth Rock up, because Magic Bounce prevents you from putting Stealth Rock onto their side. It'll just bounce back onto your side. So if you can kill Sableye, get your rocks up, that might let you start doing damage to things and forcing switches. And when you force switches and they have Stealth Rock on their side, you're starting to wear down their team. So stall it can be frustrating to play against if your team that you're using doesn't have a good matchup against it. But if you have like the tools to beat a stall team, it can be a really fun matchup to play against. And people also like to play stall because a lot of people are bad against it, so that can help you get higher on the ladder. So if all you want to do is ladder up, a lot of people get high on the ladder just playing stall teams. And some people like to play stall, you know. It's fun for some people to play a defensive strategy. I don't usually prefer it. I've played like a stall team once, and it was in a tournament. I actually have a video of that up, but it's a very legitimate strategy. And if you want to do what it takes to win, like, you have to know how to play as every team and play against every team. And if you want to learn how to break stall, playing stall is a great way to start that, because you kind of learn the ins and outs of the team. But yeah, basically stall, you want to make sure your opponent cannot kill anything on your team, and eventually they just die from hazard damage and just light attacks from things like Seismic Toss. And then you have something like a Weavile on it to pursuit trap things and kill things on the way out, kill threats to your team. And hyper offensive, you are trying to punch a hole through your opponent's team, win and overpower them super quickly. Bulky offense, you're trying to kind of absorb a few hits, get yourself into a good position, and then break through your opponent's core and punch through them, overpower them. Balance, you're trying to find pretty much any way to win, offensive or defensive, because you have both cores. So those are the four main types of team archetypes, and I want to talk about some more specifics in the future because there are so many kinds of hyper offensive, and it's really fun and really interesting to talk about all the different kinds of teams. So I'll do that in a future video, but I don't want this getting too long because it's almost 15 minutes. So I hope you have a beautiful day, and peace out. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I will be sure to answer them.